Early on the morning of July 8th, 1943, Harold Christie walked into Harry Oakes's bedroom at Westbourne, Nassau, and found the baronet dead. The skull was fractured in 4 places. The body had been partially burned. Someone had ripped open a pillow and scattered the feathers across the corpse, where they had stuck to the blood and the scorched skin. An insecticide sprayer lay nearby, a household flit gun used as an accelerant. The mattress was charred. The rest of the house was silent, no forced entry, no disturbance in the grounds. One of the richest men in the British Empire was dead in his own bed, and the scene looked less like a murder than a ritual. The first person to take control of the response was not a detective. It was the governor of the Bahamas, the former King of England. Within hours, the Duke of Windsor moved to censor the press, bypassed Scotland Yard entirely, and telephoned the Miami police to request investigators of his own choosing. The man who had once worn the crown was not reaching for the truth. He was reaching for the levers of containment. And the question of why has never been answered. This is the story of what happened when a king who abdicated for love was sent to govern a colony he despised, and of the riot, the murder, and the compromise investigation that stripped the romance bare. 5 years, one colonial posting, a labor crisis that ended in gunfire, a dead baronet in a burned bedroom, and a former king whose every instinct when the crisis came was to control the story rather than pursue the truth. To understand how a former king ended up presiding over a murder investigation in the Caribbean, you have to go back, not to the night itself, but to the kind of monarchy Edward came from, and the kind of man he turned out to be. Because the Bahamas were never simply a posting. They were a solution to a problem the British establishment had been trying to manage for years. And the problem was Edward himself. The House of Windsor, as a name, was barely a generation old when Edward was born. His grandfather, Edward VII, had been the last king to reign under the family's German dynastic title. His father, George V, rechristened the line in 1917, during a war in which German blood in a British royal family had become a political liability. The new name was English, deliberate, and disciplined. And George V built a monarchy around it that survived by restraint, by knowing what to say and what to leave unsaid, by showing up, by enduring, by never allowing private feeling to compromise public function. The crown was not a personality. It was a performance of duty so consistent that it became invisible, and that invisibility was the point. A monarch who drew attention to himself as a man rather than a symbol was, in George V's understanding, a monarch who had already failed. Edward, born on June 23, 1894, at White Lodge in Richmond Park, was raised inside this machinery. He was the eldest son, the heir, the boy whose future was written before he could walk. His childhood was formal, closely managed, and shaped by the assumption that he would one day inherit not only a throne, but a code of behavior that treated personal desire as irrelevant. His education followed the expected pattern: Naval College at Osborne and Dartmouth, then a period at Oxford. But what mattered more than the institutions was the temperament they were meant to contain. Edward was charming, he was restless, he was superb at being seen and poor at being governed. He had an instinct for the crowd and almost none for the desk. As Prince of Wales through the 20s and early 30s, he became the most visible young man in the British world, touring the empire, greeting veterans, visiting mines and factories, projecting an ease with ordinary people that his father found baffling and faintly alarming. The public adored him. He was handsome, modern, apparently informal. He had served in the Great War, not in the trenches with the frequency he later implied, but close enough to the front to be photographed there and to acquire a reputation for wanting to be near the action. Newspapers treated him as a kind of royal celebrity before the word existed in its current sense. He shook hands where previous princes had nodded. He smiled where protocol expected gravity. He dressed with a flair that fashion writers noted and the public imitated. And the crowds responded because what they saw, or thought they saw, was a man who might modernize the institution without breaking it. The empire tours of the 20s made him the most recognized face of British royalty worldwide. In Canada, in Australia, in South Africa, in India, he drew crowds that exceeded anything the monarchy had produced in living memory. The establishment watched with growing unease. Because what the tours and the smiles concealed was a man who wanted status without constraint, influence without accountability, and who experienced the obligations of his position not as purpose but as confinement. Edward did not want to be king in the way his father understood kingship. He wanted the visibility without the discipline, the stage without the script. He resented paperwork, avoided difficult briefings, and drifted toward a social world of nightclubs, married women, and wealthy friends whose company required nothing of him except charm. There was a pattern forming, visible to anyone close enough to see it. A man who could perform brilliantly in the public eye, but who could not or would not do the private work that governance demanded. George V is reported to have said, in one of the more frequently quoted royal anxieties of the era, that he hoped his eldest son would never marry and that nothing would come between the Duke of York and the throne. Whether the precise wording varied in the telling, the sentiment was consistent and widely attributed. The old king could see what others chose not to, that his heir's popularity was not the same thing as reliability, and that the qualities which made Edward captivating in a crowd made him dangerous in a palace. George V died on January 20th, 1936. Edward became king. He would remain one for 325 days. The abdication crisis is the most retold chapter of this story, and the outline of it is familiar enough that the script need not linger on its procedural mechanics. What matters is what it revealed about Edward, about the institution, and about the wound it left inside the family. Edward had been involved with Wallis Simpson, American, twice divorced, socially ambitious, and constitutionally impossible as a queen consort under the conventions of the time for several years before his accession. The British press, by informal agreement, had kept the relationship out of public view, but kingship made concealment impossible. The Church of England, whose supreme governor the king was supposed to be, would not countenance a marriage to a twice divorced woman. The government under Stanley Baldwin refused to support it. The dominions were consulted and were largely hostile. The palace itself closed ranks. Edward was offered a choice that was not really a choice. Give up the woman or give up the throne. He chose the woman. On December 10th, 1936, Edward signed the instrument of abdication at Fort Belvedere, his country retreat in Surrey. It took legal effect the following day. That evening, introduced by the BBC as His Royal Highness Prince Edward, he made the broadcast that fixed the story in public memory. The careful, slightly strained voice, the rehearsed sentiment, the phrase about the woman I love that landed in living rooms across the empire and turned a constitutional crisis into a love story. Then he left the country. His younger brother, the Duke of York, became George VI. George, known to the family as Bertie, had never wanted the crown and had never been prepared for it in the way Edward had been groomed from birth. He was reserved, earnest, physically slight, and afflicted by a stammer that made the public-speaking demands of kingship a source of genuine anguish. He was also, in ways that would only become fully visible over time, far better suited to the role than his brother had ever been. Patient, where Edward was impulsive, steady, where Edward was volatile. Willing to endure the tedium of duty, because he understood that tedium was not the cost of the crown but its substance. His wife, Elizabeth, later the Queen Mother, brought a steel that complemented his steadiness. She had not forgiven Edward for forcing the crown onto her husband's reluctant head, and she would not forgive him. That hostility was not theatrical, it was structural. It shaped palace policy toward Edward and Wallis for decades, the exclusion, the withheld courtesies, the quiet refusal to allow the exiled couple back into the family's orbit with any real warmth. In December 1936, none of that was yet fully formed. What was visible was a new king who was frightened, a new queen who was furious, and a transfer of the crown that had been not a smooth succession, but a family rupture disguised as constitutional process. Edward was created Duke of Windsor in 1937. He married Wallis in France that June at the Château de Condé, in a ceremony attended by almost none of his relatives. The palace made one decision at this point that would fester for decades. Wallis was denied the style of Her Royal Highness. It was a small bureaucratic cruelty with enormous personal consequences. Edward experienced it as a deliberate humiliation, not just of his wife, but of his sacrifice. He had given up the throne for her, and the family repaid him by refusing her the basic dignity he believed she was owed. That grievance never left him. It sat beneath every interaction with Buckingham Palace, every negotiation over allowances, every letter about status and protocol for the rest of his life. It made him petty where he might have been gracious. It made him bitter where he might have been resigned. And it made him incapable of separating personal slight from public duty because in his mind the institution had already proved that the two were the same thing. Wallis herself, born Bessie Wallace Warfield on June 19, 1896, in Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania, was by this point a woman whose public identity had been fixed by the abdication and never allowed to evolve. The world saw her as the femme fatale who had taken a king. The private reality was more complicated and in its way more confined. She had grown up in Baltimore in modest gentility, dependent on the support of relatives after her father's early death. Her first marriage, to a naval aviator named Earl Winfield Spencer, had been unhappy and marked by his heavy drinking. Her second, to the Anglo-American businessman Ernest Simpson, had given her a foothold in London society and the social confidence that came with belonging. She was sharp, socially intuitive, meticulous about presentation, and possessed of an ambition that was less about money than about position. The desire to matter, to be the woman people noticed, to occupy the center of whatever room she entered. She had wanted Edward. She had perhaps not wanted the full weight of what Edward's choice would cost them both. There is evidence in letters, in the accounts of those closest to the couple, in the testimony of friends who watched the crisis unfold, that Wallis had at points tried to withdraw before the abdication, and that it was Edward's insistence, his absolute refusal to imagine any future without her, that sealed both their fates. Whether that makes her more sympathetic or simply more trapped is a question the documentary does not need to settle. What it does need to establish is that she was not simple. She was not a villain. She was not a victim. She was a woman of considerable intelligence and limited options, locked inside a narrative written about her rather than by her, married to a man whose emotional dependency on her was total and whose sense of grievance she both shared and in private may have found exhausting. The marriage itself is worth understanding because it operated as the engine of Edward's emotional life and therefore of his governorship. Edward was dependent on Wallis in the way that certain men of his class and generation could be dependent without recognizing it as weakness, fuse, oriented entirely around her approval, incapable of functioning well without her presence and her management. Wallis was more adaptive, more socially competent, and more conscious of the performative demands of their situation. She managed him. She managed the household. She managed appearances. In a functioning royal system, those skills would have been channeled into something useful. In Exile, they produced a closed domestic world in which grievance circulated endlessly and the outside world existed primarily as a source of insult or affirmation. The marriage was not loveless, but it was sealed. And what it sealed out was precisely the kind of self-examination that might have made Edward a better governor, or at least a less dangerous one. The years between the abdication and the war were spent in restless European exile. The couple moved between France, Austria, and the fringes of fashionable continental society. They were still famous, still photographed, still invited to the houses that mattered, but they were also watched. And what the watchers saw was troubling. In October 1937, Edward and Wallis visited Nazi Germany. They met Hitler at Berchtesgaden. Edward toured factories, labor camps, and housing projects, and was photographed in postures that displayed, at minimum, a discomforting ease with the regime. The visit was not a state occasion. It was a freelance diplomatic performance by a man who had no authority to perform one, undertaken against the clear preference of the British government. It confirmed what the Foreign Office had begun to fear, that the Duke of Windsor's judgment was not merely poor, but potentially dangerous. His expressed admiration for certain aspects of the German social programs circulated in intelligence reports and deepened a suspicion that would shadow him for years. When war broke out in September 1939, Edward was given a military liaison role in France. It did not last. By the summer of 1940, with France collapsing, the Duke and Duchess found themselves in Madrid and then Lisbon, and in Lisbon, the danger crystallized. German intelligence, through intermediaries and diplomatic channels, made approaches. The precise nature of what became known as Operation Wheelie remains debated by historians, but the broad shape is documented in captured German communications and post-war files. Berlin believed Edward might be sympathetic to a negotiated peace and explored whether he could be retained in Europe, persuaded to cooperate, or positioned as a potential figurehead. Whether Edward was genuinely tempted or merely careless, the effect on British policy was decisive. Winston Churchill, who had been one of Edward's most vocal supporters during the abdication, and who understood the Duke's vanity and its potential consequences better than almost anyone in Whitehall, now concluded that Edward was a liability that could no longer be managed at a distance. He had to be removed to somewhere so far from the war's political centers that his friendships, his opinions, and his appetite for significance could do the least possible harm. Churchill's solution was the Bahamas, and the Bahamas were not a reward. They were the most elegant form of quarantine the British Empire could offer. The appointment of the Duke of Windsor as governor and commander-in-chief of the Bahamas, announced in August 1940, was presented publicly as wartime service, a royal figure doing his part for the empire in a distant colony. Privately, the entire British establishment understood what it was. The islands were remote, small, and strategically marginal beyond their usefulness as a staging area for anti-submarine patrols and transatlantic air routes. They had no diplomatic weight, no political significance, and no capacity to amplify Edward's voice in any direction that mattered. For a man who had worn the crown of England, who had been the most popular prince in the world, the posting was a demotion so transparent that even the pretense of dignity required collective effort. Edward knew it. Wallace knew it. Churchill knew it. The Colonial Office knew it. The only people who were not supposed to acknowledge it were the public and the Bahamians themselves. Edward and Wallace arrived in Nassau in August 1940. The colonial ceremony was performed. White uniforms, official cars, the governor's flag, the formal receiving line, the small-scale theater of imperial welcome that the British exported to every corner of the world and enacted with identical solemnity, whether the colony was a jewel or a footnote. Government House, the official residence overlooking Nassau Harbor, was a handsome enough building in the colonial style. Wallace found it inadequate. Its renovation, expensive, elaborate, funded in part from wartime public sources, became one of the first points of friction and one of the first signals of the couple's particular blindness. Comfort was not a luxury to the Windsors. It was an entitlement. And the gap between what they believed they deserved and what a poor colonial territory could offer was, from the very first week, a source of resentment that colored every aspect of the posting. But Nassau was not simply a stage for the Windsors' grievances. The colony Edward was sent to govern had its own history, its own fractures, and its own population, whose experience of the war years bore no resemblance whatsoever to the world inside Government House. Wartime Nassau was a racially stratified society controlled by a white mercantile oligarchy known informally as the Bay Street Boys. A compact group of businessmen, property developers, and political operators whose power rested on trade, land ownership, and the systematic exclusion of the black Bahamian majority from meaningful political or economic life. Black Bahamians constituted the overwhelming bulk of the population, but held almost no political power. Wages were desperately low. Housing was poor. Education was limited. The sponging industry, which had sustained parts of the economy for decades, had collapsed after a devastating blight in 1938 and 1939, leaving entire communities without their primary livelihood. Wartime disruption sharpened unemployment and hardship across the out islands and in Nassau itself. And into this volatile landscape came new pressures from outside. American military construction contracts bringing money and outside expectations, and a labor program known locally as the Project, which recruited Bahamian workers for agricultural and construction work in the United States under conditions that exposed them to legalized Jim Crow segregation. The workers who went to America and experienced that segregation came back changed, more politically aware, more conscious of their own exploitation, and less willing to accept the colonial order that the Bay Street establishment regarded as natural and permanent. The colonial administration had not anticipated this. It could not easily manage it. This was the colony Edward was supposed to lead. These were the fault lines he was supposed to understand. And into the middle of it all, the social world of wartime Nassau arranged itself around the new governor with its own logic of money, access, and mutual dependency. Sir Harry Oakes, born December 23rd, 1874, in Sangerville, Maine, was the most conspicuous figure in the Duke's orbit. Oakes had made his fortune in gold mining at Kirkland Lake in northern Ontario, one of the great mineral strikes of the early 20th century. The wealth it generated was enormous. Estimates placed it in the tens of millions of pounds, and it had allowed him to live entirely on his own terms. He had left Canada for the Bahamas in the mid-1930s, drawn by the absence of income tax and the freedom a small, malleable colonial society offered to a man of his resources. He had been created a baronet. He owned vast tracts of land. He built a golf course, constructed an airfield, funded civic projects, employed local workers, and operated within the colony's white elite with the blunt, physical confidence that very large sums of money produce. He was not refined. He was tough, direct to the point of abrasiveness, generous when he chose to be, and hostile when crossed. He was married to Eunice, an Australian woman who anchored the domestic world of Westbourne, their estate, a household that would, within 3 years, become the most scrutinized crime scene in Bahamian history. For the moment, though, Oakes was simply what he appeared, a mining magnate turned colonial grandee, rich enough to matter to a governor, close enough to be useful, and independent enough to be volatile. His daughter Nancy, young, glamorous, and socially prominent in her own right, had recently married Count Alfred de Marigny, a twice-divorced Mauritian of French extraction, whose flamboyance and outsider status made him an uneasy fit within Nassau's establishment circles. The marriage had not pleased Oakes. It would, after the events of 1943, become one of the story's most emotionally charged threads. But for now, it was simply one more tension line running through a social whirl already dense with them. Harold Christie was the fixer. Bahamian-born, a property developer and political insider, Christie operated at the intersection of land, money, and influence that made Bay Street's power structure function. He was close to Oakes, close to the colonial establishment, and positioned at the center of a web of relationships whose full significance would only become apparent after the catastrophe of 1943. He was the man a governor needed, someone who could translate between the official machinery and the informal reality, who knew where the deals were done, the favors owed, and the secrets kept. And there was Axel Wenner-Gren, Swedish, immensely wealthy, a founder of Electrolux, an owner of yachts and island properties, and a figure who moved through Nassau's wartime social world with the ease of a man who believed that money could purchase immunity from scrutiny. It could not. Both American and British intelligence regarded Wenner-Gren with concern that went beyond social disapproval. His business interests were international and opaque. His associations in Latin America and Europe raised questions that intelligence services took seriously enough to generate official files. The United States eventually placed him on its proclaimed list of blocked nationals, and yet Edward maintained the friendship. British Foreign Office files from the period record explicit anxiety about the Duke's association with Wenner-Gren, not as evidence of treason, but as proof of something almost as damaging. A governor who could not recognize, even under wartime conditions, that certain friendships carried costs a man in his position could not afford. Edward kept gravitating toward men who made governments nervous. He had done it in London, he had done it in Berlin, he had done it in Lisbon, and he did it again in Nassau because the quality that made him appealing in a drawing room, an openness, a disregard for the careful boundaries that protected men in public life, was the same quality that made intelligence officers reach for their files. For a window of time, perhaps a year, perhaps 18 months, the surface held. And it held convincingly enough that even skeptical observers might have been forgiven for thinking the posting was working. The Windsors entertained. There were formal dinners at Government House, receptions for visiting dignitaries, the rituals of colonial society performed with enough polish to sustain the appearance of purpose. Wallis, whatever she thought privately, threw herself into the social management of the household with the precision she brought to everything. The table settings were immaculate. The guest lists were curated. The evenings ran smoothly. She understood, in a way that Edward sometimes did not, that the social performance was the only currency they had left. If they could not govern with distinction, They could at least preside with style. And for a time, the style was enough. The photographs from this period show what they were meant to show: a handsome couple in tropical whites, the harbor behind them, the flag above them, the entire visual apparatus of colonial governance suggesting order, purpose, and something that, at a distance, could pass for contentment. The parties at Government House and at the homes of the island's wealthy residents had a hothouse quality. Orchids, crystal, the low hum of careful conversation, the sense of a world performing elegance against a backdrop it preferred not to examine too closely. Beyond Bay Street, beyond the harbor, beyond the white columned verandas, Nassau's black majority lived in conditions that would have been unrecognizable to most of the dinner guests. The contrast was not hidden. It was simply unacknowledged, absorbed into the architecture of colonial life, in the same way the heat was absorbed into the walls. Edward, to his partial credit, was not entirely disengaged from the colony's realities. He took an interest in employment, in conditions on the out islands, in the mechanics of the wartime labor allocation. Some later Bahamian accounts, oral histories, administrative records, the recollections of officials who served during the period credit the Duke with moments of genuine concern: visits to settlements, directives about public works, attention to unemployment figures that complicated the portrait of pure aristocratic indifference. He was not inert. He was something more frustrating than inert, intermittently engaged, occasionally perceptive, but fundamentally unreliable because his resentments, his prejudices, and his appetite for recognition never left the room. He could express concern about black unemployment in the morning and accept the social company of the very men whose fortunes depended on the structures producing it by evening. He could note the colony's poverty in official correspondence and then spend months fighting for the renovation of Government House. The contradictions were not occasional lapses. They were the texture of his character, the permanent gap between what he could see and what he was willing to change. Around and beneath this performance, the first shadows were already visible to those who knew where to look. The censorship apparatus of the wartime Bahamas was not large, but it existed, and Edward's relationship to it would prove revealing. Surviving correspondence from the period, including letters held by the Imperial War Museums, shows a governor who complained about the censorship of his wife's private mail and later thanked the colony's chief censor for supplying him with intelligence reports drawn from intercepted communications. The details are small and bureaucratic, but they are quietly damning. They show a man who wanted the rules of censorship bent around his private life while simultaneously drawing the machinery of surveillance inward toward himself. It was not conspiracy. It was something more characteristic, an instinct for control dressed as entitlement, the assumption that information should flow toward power and that the normal rules applied to other people. That instinct to manage information, to control the narrative, to treat transparency as a threat, would matter enormously when less than 2 years later, the governor was faced with a murder inside his own social circle. The social world the Windsors moved through was small, wealthy, and self-enclosed. Government House, Westbourne, Bay Street, the Yacht Club, the harborside gatherings where the Duke and Duchess mingled with men whose fortunes and connections overlapped in ways that were convenient and in some cases compromising. Nassau's wartime elite was not large enough to allow distance between its members. Everyone knew everyone. Everyone dined with everyone. And the web of hospitality, favor, and mutual dependence that bound this circle together was growing tighter with every month. Not because anyone was planning a catastrophe, but because a catastrophe is what becomes possible when power is concentrated, accountability is absent, and the man at the top has spent his entire adult life confusing privilege with competence. This was the world the Windsors occupied as the calendar turned from 1941 into 1942. Publicly, the photographs continued to tell the sanctioned story: a handsome couple doing their wartime duty in a tropical colony, the Duchess in white linen, the Duke in his governor's uniform, harbor light, palm trees, the performance of order in a place that looked from the right angle almost like paradise. But the colony was not quiet. It was loaded with poverty, with racial grievance, with wartime anxiety, with the accumulated weight of an elite world in which money, secrecy, and colonial power were so thoroughly entangled that no one inside the circle could see where one ended and the others began. The Duke's friendships were drawing intelligent scrutiny from London and Washington. The colonial labor force was moving toward a breaking point that the Bay Street establishment refused to take seriously. The system of social control that held the elegant facade in place, the censorship, the deference, the racial hierarchy, the assumption that the natural order would hold because it always had, was under pressures it had never been built to withstand. The couple had arrived at what the world was told was a tropical posting. What they had entered was a pressure chamber, a colony whose inequalities were combustible, whose elite was compromised by proximity, and whose governor carried within him every flaw the institution had tried to exile out of reach. The Bahamas had not neutralized Edward's weaknesses. They had given them room. The smaller stage did not produce smaller consequences. It produced a concentration of power, secrecy, and resentment dense enough that when the explosion came, it would not be possible to separate the governor's failures from the colonies. And by the spring of 1942, that explosion was very close indeed. If this story has you as captivated as I think it has, do subscribe. What happened next to this family is something the public never knew. And we're only just beginning. The Bahamas were never a soft landing. They were a test Edward was poorly equipped to pass. And by the early months of 1942, the gap between the public image of the posting and its private reality had become impossible for anyone close to the situation to ignore. The daily texture of the governorship was, for Edward, a long sequence of small humiliations. The stage was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. Government House, even after the renovation that had consumed Wallace's attention and the colony's money, remained what it was, a colonial residence in a minor territory, not a European palace or Parisian townhouse. The social circuit was limited. The same faces at the same dinners, the same conversations about the same narrow range of subjects that a small island could sustain. The diplomatic visitors were few, and those who did come were rarely of the caliber that Edward believed his status deserved. The distance from Europe, from the war, from the politics that mattered, from the people whose company Edward believed was his due, was not a buffer, but a punishment experienced fresh each morning. He could read about the war in delayed newspapers. He could follow the movements of his brother, the king, from a distance of several thousand miles and an emotional distance that was greater still. He could mark the passage of time in the tropics and feel with every month the gap between what he had been and what he had become widening into something that looked from certain angles permanent. He complained in letters. He complained to officials. He complained to Wallace, who complained alongside him, but with a sharper awareness of how the complaints sounded to those who had to hear them. Wallace's frustration was, if anything, more focused than Edward's. She had always understood social hierarchies with a precision that Edward, born at the top, had never needed to develop. She knew exactly where the Bahamas placed them in the world's estimation, and the knowledge was corrosive. She channeled it into the management of their domestic life, the meticulous hostessing, the insistence on standards, the determination that if they were going to be exiled, they would at least be exiled with taste. But the resentment beneath the performance was constant and shared. The couple were not discreet about their unhappiness. They did not need to be. In Nassau, there was no one powerful enough to make them pay for their contempt, and no one close enough to London to report it with consequences. Or so they believed. In fact, Edward's behavior was being watched and reported with a specificity that would have alarmed him had he understood his full scope. The Foreign Office and the intelligence services had not stopped paying attention simply because the Duke had been parked in the Caribbean. The files kept growing. Official concern about the Duke's wartime judgment, his comments about the war, his opinions about peace negotiations, his associations with figures who attracted the attention of Allied intelligence had not been a one-off episode tied to Lisbon and the shadow of Operation Willie. It was a continuing condition. The record trail around the Duke's activities in the Bahamas, partially preserved in National Archives files, shows a pattern that intelligence analysts found troubling. Not dramatic acts of sabotage or treachery, but a persistent low-level stream of poor judgment that kept the Duke inside the orbit of concern. The Wenner-Gren friendship was the most visible of these anxieties, but it was not the only one. The file headings alone tell the story. U.S. reaction to the Duke's activities. the Duke's links to Wenner-Gren, concern over the Duke's views on the outcome of the war. These were not tabloid headlines. They were the filing categories of a bureaucracy that had decided the former king warranted ongoing surveillance. Edward's comments about the war's likely outcome, his stated skepticism at various points about Britain's ability to prevail, his apparent openness to the idea of a negotiated peace, his impatience with what he regarded as Churchill's stubbornness, circulated in intelligence circles and reached the desks of men who took such things seriously. The Duke's views were not unusual for a certain type of upper-class Englishman in 1940 and 1941. Defeatism was not confined to exiled kings. There were drawing rooms across Mayfair where similar opinions were expressed over similar drinks. But Edward was not an ordinary private citizen expressing private doubts over dinner. He was the former king-emperor holding a colonial governorship under the crown, and his opinions carried a symbolic weight that his personality made it impossible for him to understand. He thought he was expressing pragmatism. He thought he was being realistic. The Foreign Office heard something closer to liability, and the distinction between pragmatism and liability in wartime was not academic. It was the kind of distinction on which careers, reputations, and occasionally lives depended. Then there was the censorship question. It surfaced in small ways, bureaucratic, easily overlooked, but cumulatively revealing. Edward's complaints about the censorship of Wallace's correspondence and his subsequent use of the censorship apparatus for his own intelligence gathering told a story that went beyond personal inconvenience. They showed a governor who understood that information was power, but who could not grasp that the power of information in wartime was supposed to be exercised on behalf of the state, not the state's most awkward resident. The letters held by the Imperial War Museums, Edward thanking the colony's chief censor for supplying intelligence reports, are the kind of documents that look innocuous in isolation and devastating in context. They are proof not of conspiracy, but of something that in a governor may be worse, a constitutional inability to distinguish between what belonged to the office and what belonged to the man. None of this was publicly visible in 1941 and early 1942. The photographs continued. The receptions continued. The performance of tropical governance continued in the visual key that the palace and the colonial office required. But beneath that surface, two realities were converging that would, within months, tear the facade apart. The first was the reality of Edward's compromised position. The intelligence concerns, the friendships, the censorship instincts, the ongoing sense in London that the Duke remained a problem not yet fully contained. The second was the reality of the colony itself, which had its own crisis building and which Edward's limitations as a governor were about to make very much worse. The wartime Bahamas were not simply poor. They were structurally volatile in a way that the white elite, insulated by money and habit, refused to recognize until it was too late. The collapse of the sponging industry had removed a significant source of employment for Black Bahamians at exactly the moment when wartime disruption was making every other source of income less reliable. Food prices were rising. Wages, where work existed, were stagnant. And the American military presence on the islands, the construction of airfields, the expansion of naval facilities, had introduced a new economic logic that made the old colonial wage structure look not merely unfair, but deliberately punitive. The critical mechanism was the project. Under this scheme, Bahamian workers were recruited for contract labor in the United States, primarily agricultural work in the fields of the American South and construction work on military facilities in Florida and elsewhere. The wages on the project were significantly higher than anything available in Nassau. American contractors paid rates that, by Bahamian standards, represented a different economic universe entirely. A man who could earn a few shillings a day on a Nassau building site might earn several times that amount on an American contract. The difference was not marginal. It was transformative. And it created two immediate problems that the colonial administration had no mechanism to address. The first was practical. Bahamian employers, including the Bay Street merchants who controlled the colony's economy, could not or would not match American rates, and they resented a labor scheme that drained workers away from local employment at the wages they considered dangerously inflationary. The Bay Street position was, in essence, that Bahamian workers should remain grateful for whatever the colony's employers chose to pay them, and that the American contracts were an irritant to be endured rather than the signal that local wages were indefensibly low. The second problem was political, and it was far more dangerous than the first. The Bahamian workers who went to the United States experienced, alongside the higher wages, the full apparatus of Jim Crow segregation. They ate in separate facilities. They slept in separate quarters. They were addressed in language and subjected to treatment that made the racial hierarchy of the Bahamas, oppressive as it was, look comparatively informal. And that experience, the shock of American-style legalized racism, encountered by men who had been told they were subjects of the British Crown and entitled to its protections, transformed their understanding of their own position. They came back to Nassau not merely with money, but with a sharpened political consciousness, a vocabulary for naming injustice, and a diminished willingness to accept the colonial hierarchy as natural, inevitable, or permanent. The Bay Street boys did not adjust. They could not adjust because adjustment would have meant acknowledging that the racial and economic structure on which their power rested was neither natural nor permanent, and that acknowledgement was incompatible with everything they believed about themselves and the world they had built. The merchants' response to wage pressure was not concession, but resistance. Local wages remained low. The gap between what Bahamian workers could earn on the project and what they were offered at home widened, and the resentment, already present, already sharpened by poverty and racial exclusion, intensified through the early months of 1942 until it became something that the colonial administration could no longer manage through deference, delay, and the assumption that the existing order would hold. Edward, as governor, sat at the top of this structure. His relationship to the colony's racial hierarchy was complex, in the way that the racial attitudes of men like him were always complex. Not the overt bigotry of a dedicated supremacist, but the deeper, more insidious assumption that the hierarchy was simply the way things were, that Black Bahamians occupied their position because that was where they belonged, and that the function of government was to maintain order within the existing arrangement rather than to question the arrangement itself. He was not uniquely cruel, he was typically blind. And typical blindness in a colony approaching crisis was more than enough to guarantee disaster. The crisis came in late May and early June of 1942, and it came with a speed that revealed how much pressure had been building beneath the surface of colonial order. On May 29th, laborers working on construction projects, many of them employed through the wartime building program that the American military presence had generated, formally sought wage increases. The demand was not radical, it was not revolutionary. The workers were asking for pay that bore some reasonable relationship to the wages available on the project and the rising cost of living in Nassau. A laborer building an airfield for the war effort was not asking for luxury. He was asking to feed his family at prices that the war itself had driven upward. The request went through official channels, through foremen, through the labor office, through the modest bureaucratic apparatus that the colonial government maintained for the purpose of processing exactly this kind of grievance without actually resolving it. Discussions were held. The discussions brought together men who occupied different sides of a divide so vast that meaningful negotiation was almost impossible. On one side, workers whose wages had been set by employers who regarded black labor as essentially inexhaustible and infinitely cheap. On the other, those same employers sitting in the colonial legislature, whose economic interests and racial assumptions made the idea of meaningful wage increases feel less like a concession than a capitulation. The discussions failed. The Bay Street establishment would not concede what the workers were asking. The workers, who had been watching their purchasing power erode while American contractors paid their countrymen multiples of the local rate, would not accept the refusal. On June 1st, 1942, the situation broke. What had been a labor dispute became a riot. The workers gathered in the early morning. Construction laborers, men from the building sites, men who had been told that the wages they needed to feed their families were more than the colony's employers were prepared to pay. They moved toward Bay Street, And Bay Street, that narrow commercial strip that functioned as the symbolic and literal center of white mercantile power in the Bahamas, became the site of the colony's most violent civil disturbance in living memory. The parliamentary record, Hansard's account of the debate on June 17, 1942, gives the administrative skeleton of what happened. By 9 o'clock in the morning, approximately 1,000 men were rioting in Nassau. The violence was concentrated on Bay Street itself. Shop windows were smashed, merchandise was seized, property was damaged and looted. The energy of the crowd was not random. It was directed at the commercial establishments that represented in concrete and glass the economic system that had kept black Bahamians poor, while the men who owned those shops grew wealthy from their labor. The scale and speed of the outbreak overwhelmed the small colonial police force, which was neither equipped nor trained for disorder on this scale. The Cameron Highlanders, a British Army unit stationed on the island, were called in. The Riot Act was read, that ancient formula of British law still carrying the authority of the Crown, now spoken into the heat and noise of a Caribbean street. Armed intervention followed. Shots were fired into the crowd. 2 rioters were killed, 7 were wounded. A curfew was imposed over Nassau, and the Bay Street that had been the pride of the white establishment lay damaged, its shop fronts broken, its merchandise scattered, and the assumption of permanent racial order that it represented cracked beyond easy repair. Edward was not on the island when the riot began. He was in the United States, in Washington, according to most accounts, and had to return to Nassau in the immediate aftermath. That absence is significant not because a governor's physical presence would necessarily have prevented the outbreak, but because it captures something essential about the mismatch between Edward's conception of his role and the colony's need for actual governance. He was away. He was elsewhere. He was attending to his own life, while the society he was supposed to be leading came apart. He returned on the Tuesday following the outbreak, and what he did next was, by several accounts, the most competent act of his entire governorship, which is both a genuine compliment and a measure of how low the bar had been set. Edward met with community leaders. He met with labor representatives. He walked through parts of the affected area, visible to the population in a way that the preceding months of government house entertaining had never required. He broadcast to the colony, and the broadcast itself was a performance that drew on the one skill Edward had never lost: the ability to command a room, or in this case, an island, through the force of his presence and his voice. He called for order to be restored before negotiations could resume. He struck a tone that was paternalistic but measured, the tone of a man who expected to be obeyed, but who acknowledged, at least in the cadence of his words, that the people he was addressing had reason to be angry. He was direct. He was present. He was visible in a way that colonial governors were not always willing to be in the aftermath of violence. Some later Bahamian accounts credit this intervention with helping to stabilize a situation that could have deteriorated further. The Duke's willingness to return quickly, to appear in public, to speak to the people involved rather than to speak about them from behind the walls of Government House, was noted and by some genuinely appreciated. It was the one moment in his governorship when the skills that had once made him the most popular prince in the empire, the ease with people, the physical courage, the instinct for the crowd, were applied to something that actually mattered. But the credit is limited, and the limitations matter more than the credit because they reveal what the riot had actually exposed. Edward's response to the crisis was the response of a man who understood order, but not justice. He wanted calm. He wanted the streets cleared, the curfew respected, the machinery of colonial administration restored to working condition. What he did not want, and what he was constitutionally unable to want, was a reckoning with the conditions that had produced the violence in the first place. His broadcast called for order before negotiation. The sequencing was not accidental. It reflected a worldview in which the existing hierarchy was the baseline to which all disruption must return before the people at the bottom of that hierarchy could be permitted to state their grievances. The workers had to submit before they could speak. That was not a policy. It was an instinct bred into a man who had been raised at the apex of the most elaborately stratified society in the Western world. After the immediate crisis passed, the consequences settled into the colony like sediment. The dead were buried. The wounded recovered or did not. The curfew was eventually lifted. A commission of inquiry was established, the kind of administrative response that colonial governments reached for when violence had exposed a structural failure they were not prepared to address structurally. Some wage adjustments were made, modest, insufficient, enough to demonstrate that the establishment had heard the complaint without actually conceding the underlying principle. The Bay Street merchants returned to their shops, repaired their windows, restocked their shelves, and resumed the business of profiting from a society whose deepest inequalities they regarded as the natural order of things. But the riot had changed something in the relationship between the colonial government and the people it governed. And that change could not be walked back by commissions, curfews, or modest wage concessions. Black Bahamians had seen what happened when they demanded what was owed to them. They had been shot. 2 of their number had been killed. The colonial response had been, in essence, violence first and conversation after, and the governor who presided over that response, the former king, the man in the white uniform, the representative of the crown and the empire, had returned from Washington, spoken his piece, and retreated to Government House, while the underlying conditions that had caused the explosion remained essentially unchanged. The racial hierarchy was intact. The wage structure was barely modified. The Bay Street Boys still controlled the legislature, the economy, and the terms on which Black Bahamians were permitted to exist in their own country. What had changed was that the pretense of contentment was gone. The colony's Black majority had shown what it was prepared to do, and the colony's white minority had shown what it was prepared to do in return. The social contract, such as it was, had been renegotiated in blood and curfew, and the new terms were worse for everyone. For Edward personally, the riot should have been a reckoning. It should have forced a reappraisal of his fitness for the role, his understanding of the colony, his capacity to lead a society in crisis. It did not. The Duke appears to have absorbed the riot as a disruption to be managed rather than a revelation to be understood. His private correspondence from the period does not suggest a man transformed by what he had witnessed. It suggests a man who had added one more grievance to his collection. The colony was even worse than he had thought. The people were ungrateful. The posting was impossible. Without grasping that the grievance belonged to Nassau's Black population, not to him, and the wider world barely noticed. The riot in Nassau was not a major wartime news story. It was a colonial disturbance in a minor territory, overwhelmed in the press by the battles of 1942, Midway, Stalingrad, El Alamein. The vast machinery of global war that made a labor riot on a Caribbean island seem, from London or Washington, like a footnote. But it was not a footnote. It was a fracture. And everything that followed in the Bahamas, in the deepening tensions, the compromised networks, the elite circle drawing tighter around its secrets, and eventually the murder that would define Edward's governorship forever, grew out of the soil that the riot had turned. The immediate aftermath settled into an uneasy, watchful quiet. The curfew was lifted, the shops on Bay Street reopened, the construction projects resumed, the governor returned to the routines of colonial administration, and the Duchess returned to the routines of colonial society, and the photographs resumed their function of showing a world that had never existed. But the colony was different now. Its people had spoken, and what they had said could not be unsaid. The facade of tropical order had cracked from below, and the crack ran deeper than any repair the administration was willing to attempt. Edward's public image, ironically, may have benefited briefly from the crisis. He had returned. He had acted. He had been seen. In certain accounts, he was the governor who steadied the ship. But steadying a ship is not the same thing as repairing its hull. And the hull of colonial Nassau was now compromised in ways that would determine everything that came next. The racial tension had not eased. By many accounts, it intensified. The gap between the world the Windsors inhabited and the world most Bahamians endured had become morally unavoidable. Not because it was new, but because it had been publicly, violently exposed, and the governor's response had demonstrated that exposure alone would not produce change. The governorship now carried a different weight. Before the riot, Edward's posting could be discussed primarily in terms of the old abdication scandal. A disgraced king in tropical exile, a love story with a colonial coda, a man and his American wife living out their diminished years against a backdrop of palm trees and harbor light. That framing was comfortable. It was romantic. It was containable. After the riot, the posting carried something harder and less containable. fresh colonial blood. The blood of men who had asked for fair wages and been answered with gunfire under the authority of the crown, administered by a governor who had once worn that crown and proved unequal to its demands. And the governor who had presided over that answer was the same man whose judgment had already been questioned by the Foreign Office, whose friendships had already drawn intelligence concern, and whose instinct for censorship and narrative control had already been quietly documented in official files. The months that followed the riot, the second half of 1942 and into 1943, saw the colony settle into a condition that was neither peaceful nor openly conflicted, but something more corrosive. A state of suppressed tension in which the official narrative and the lived reality had permanently diverged. The Bay Street establishment went back to business. The construction projects continued. The war went on, and the social world around the Duke, the dinners, the harbor evenings, the small circle of wealthy men and their wives carried on as before, only now with the knowledge that the society they moved through had been exposed as fundamentally fragile. It was in this atmosphere, watchful, tense, socially sealed, racially fractured, that the relationships binding the colony's elite began to carry a different charge. Oakes was still rich, still loud, still central to the social and economic machinery of white Nassau. His money flowed through the colony in ways that made him simultaneously a benefactor and a power broker. The man who built things, employed people, funded projects, and expected in return the deference that very large fortunes have always demanded. His relationship with the Duke had the quality of an alliance between two men who needed each other for different reasons. Edward needed Oakes because the mining baron's wealth and social gravity anchored the governor's otherwise diminished world. Oakes needed the governor because proximity to a former king, even a disgraced one, conferred a status that money alone could not purchase. It was symbiotic, it was uneasy, and it was growing more entangled as the war continued, as the colony's tensions deepened, and as the circle of men who controlled Nassau's white world drew closer, together in response to pressures they could feel but would not name. Christie was still the fixer, still indispensable, still the man who knew how things actually worked beneath the surface of colonial propriety. His property interests, his political connections, his intimacy with the mechanics of Bay Street commerce, all of these made him the man Edward relied on when the official machinery proved inadequate, which in Nassau was often. The Duke was still the governor, still compromised, still nursing wounds that had nothing to do with the colony and everything to do with the life he believed he had been cheated of. And Wallis was still performing, managing the household, managing her husband, managing the social calendar with a precision that had become, by 1942, less a pleasure than a survival mechanism. The dinner parties continued, the guest list circulated, the harbor evenings carried on. But the mood had shifted. The confidence of the first year, the breezy, almost self-congratulatory assurance that the posting could be endured with style, had been replaced by something closer to vigilance. The colony had shown what it was capable of. The elite had seen the crowd on Bay Street and heard the gunshots and watched the curfew descend, and even if they chose not to speak of it over drinks, the knowledge was in the room. And around all of them, the web of money, land, wartime profit, and mutual exposure continued to tighten. The riot was over. The dead were buried. The colony had shown what lay beneath the white facades and the harborside civilities. And the Duke of Windsor had learned, if he was capable of learning, that the Bahamas were not a quiet colonial stage on which to perform the remaining acts of his exile. They were a place where real people lived, where real violence happened, where the consequences of colonial power fell not on the men who wielded it from Government House, but on the men and women who lived beneath it in the settlements and the labor camps and the cramped streets behind Bay Street. Within little more than a year, one of the richest men in the same tight-knit elite circle, a man who dined with the governor, who lent his estate and his money to the social machinery of colonial Nassau, who seemed as permanently embedded in the island's power structure as Bay Street itself, would be found dead in his own bed, in circumstances so grotesque that the murder would become the most famous unsolved case in Bahamian history. And the governor, the former king, would reach, in the first hours after the discovery, not for transparency, but for control. The island had already shown him what happened when pressure found no outlet. He had not learned. He would not learn, and the next explosion would be worse. After the riot, the nature of the story changed. What had been a tale of glamorous exile, a disgraced king and his American wife performing colonial duty in the tropics, became something darker, more entangled, and far more difficult for anyone involved to control. The public disorder of June 1942 had exposed the colony's fractures. What followed in the months between the riot and the catastrophe of July 1943 was the slower, less visible process of private rot, the tightening of networks, the hardening of defensive instincts, and the quiet accumulation of tensions within the elite circle that surrounded the Duke of Windsor. Tensions that would, when the breaking point arrived, make an honest reckoning almost impossible. Edward's governorship after the riot settled into a pattern that was, in its way, more revealing than the riot itself. The crisis had shown what he could do under pressure: return, appear, speak, restore a surface calm. It had also shown the limits of what he was willing to do once the surface was restored. The structural condition that had produced the violence remained essentially unchanged. The Bay Street oligarchy still controlled the economy. Black wages were still depressed. The racial hierarchy was still intact. The Commission of Inquiry produced recommendations. Some were implemented, most were diluted, and none addressed the fundamental inequality of a society in which political and economic power was held by a white minority whose interest in reform extended only as far as the minimum necessary to prevent another outbreak. Edward administered this arrangement. He did not challenge it. He could not have challenged it without challenging the assumptions on which his own position rested. The assumption that hierarchy was natural, that authority flowed downward, that the men at the top of a colonial society belonged there by virtue of qualities that the men at the bottom lacked. Those assumptions were not Edward's alone. They were the assumptions of the empire itself. But in Nassau, where the hierarchy was so small and so naked that its workings were visible to anyone who cared to look, the assumptions carried a weight that more established colonies could diffuse across a larger bureaucracy. In Nassau, the governor was the hierarchy, and the governor was Edward. What changed after the riot was not the colony's structure, but its atmosphere. Nassau in the second half of 1942 and into 1943 was a place where everyone who mattered knew that the official version of events could not be trusted, but where no one who mattered had the power or the inclination to replace it with something honest. The Bay Street merchants knew the wages were unjust. The colonial administration knew the racial order was unsustainable. The Duke knew that his posting was a failure in everything except the narrow sense that he had not yet been recalled. And yet the machinery of colonial life continued to operate as if the riot had been an aberration rather than a revelation, as if order had been restored rather than merely reimposed, and as if the tensions that had produced the explosion had been addressed rather than suppressed. It was in this atmosphere of willful unreality that Edward's behavior began to shift in ways that would matter enormously when the crisis of 1943 arrived. The shift was not dramatic. It was incremental, bureaucratic, and largely invisible to anyone not paying close attention, but it amounted to a consolidation of the instincts that had always been present in his character: the instinct for control, the instinct for narrative management, the conviction that information should be gathered, held, and deployed by the man at the center rather than allowed to circulate freely. After the riot, Edward became more defensive, more managerial, more attentive to the levers of colonial power that allowed a governor to shape what was said, what was known, and what was permitted to reach the wider world. This was not a man transforming into an autocrat. It was a man whose existing tendencies, the preference for control over transparency, the assumption that authority entitled him to determine the boundaries of public knowledge, were being reinforced by the experience of governing a colony that had just demonstrated how quickly control could be lost. Edward had seen the crowd on Bay Street. He had seen the curfew and the troops and the broken glass. And the lesson he drew from that experience was not that the colony needed reform, but that the colony needed management. Tighter, more careful, more attentive to the flow of information and the maintenance of appearances. It was the wrong lesson, but it was the lesson his character was built to learn. Wallis, in her own way, was performing a parallel consolidation. Her role in Nassau had always been primarily social: hostess, manager, the woman who made Government House function as a stage for the couple's diminished performance of royal life. After the riot, that social role took on a more defensive quality. The dinners continued. The guest lists were maintained, the harbor evenings and the country house visits and the cocktail hours at Government House carried on with the same surface polish. But the purpose had shifted. The social sphere was no longer about display for its own sake. It was about insulation, the maintenance of a world in which the Windsors and their circle could continue to operate as if the colony beyond Bay Street did not exist, or existed only as a problem to be managed from above. Wallis was good at this. She had always been good at creating controlled social environments. It was this skill she had brought to London society, to the abdication, and to the long European exile that followed. In Nassau, she deployed it with the focus of a woman who understood that the alternative to a managed social world was an unmanaged reality she could not face. Around the Windsors, the elite circle of wartime Nassau continued to operate according to its own internal logic, a logic that the riot had disrupted but not dismantled. The men who mattered in Nassau were still the same men who had mattered before the violence. The Bay Street merchants, the property developers, the colonial officials, the handful of extremely wealthy expatriates who had come to the Bahamas for the tax advantages and stayed because the island's smallness gave their money a power it would not have commanded in London or New York. And at the center of that world, as he had been from the beginning, was Harry Oakes. Understanding Oakes before the murder is essential, because the documentary's central event will land with its full weight only if the audience knows him as a man, not merely as a victim. And Oakes, as a man, was a figure of considerable force and considerable contradiction. He had not been born to wealth. His fortune was entirely self-made, and the making of it had been the defining experience of his life, the crucible that had shaped his character and his understanding of what the world owed him, which was nothing. Harry Oakes had spent the better part of 2 decades prospecting for gold across 4 continents. He had searched in Australia, in Alaska, in California, in the Klondike, in the Philippines, in the Belgian Congo, moving from claim to claim, failure to failure, with a persistence that was either visionary or pathological, depending on when you encountered him in the sequence. The years of hardship were real. He slept rough. He went hungry. He worked with his hands in conditions that would have broken men with less stamina or less obsession. And then, in 1912, at Kirkland Lake in northern Ontario, he found what he had been looking for. The gold deposit was massive. It would become one of the most productive mines in Canadian history. And Harry Oakes, who had spent his youth as a wandering prospector with nothing but conviction and endurance, became, almost overnight, one of the richest men in the world. The transformation from poverty to wealth had been so dramatic and so hard-earned that it defined everything about the man who emerged on the other side. Oakes was tough in the way that men who have spent years sleeping rough and working with their hands are tough, physically hard, temperamentally blunt, impatient with pretension, and convinced that the world owed him nothing because he had earned everything he possessed through his own labor. He did not have the manners of inherited wealth. He had the manners of a man who had fought for everything and who expected the world to acknowledge the fight. His fortune, once established, grew to the proportions that made him one of the wealthiest men in the entire British Empire. Estimates place his net worth at somewhere between 20 and 30 million pounds, a sum that in the 1930s commanded a purchasing power almost beyond modern comprehension. And that wealth had generated the predictable consequences, a baronetcy, conferred in 1939, a country estate, the social position that very large sums of money automatically confer, and a relationship with the Canadian tax authority so hostile that it had driven him out of the country altogether. He had come to the Bahamas because the Bahamas had no income tax. The motivation was not complicated. Oakes had made his money through decades of physical labor and relentless persistence, and he was not prepared to hand a substantial portion of it to any government. The Bahamas offered him what he wanted, freedom from taxation, a society small enough that his money made him one of its most important men, and a climate in which he could live as he pleased. He bought land, and vast quantities of it. He built, he employed, he funded civic projects with a generosity that was genuine even as it was self-interested, because in a colony as small as the Bahamas, philanthropy and power were difficult to separate. The golf course, the airfield, the employment of local workers, all of these made Oakes a figure of consequence in Nassau, a man whose decisions affected the lives of hundreds of people, and whose displeasure could reshape the colony's commercial landscape overnight. His personality matched his history. He was direct to the point of rudeness, a man who had no use for the careful diplomatic evasions that colonial society considered essential and that Wallace Windsor in particular insisted upon. He could be generous, lavishly so, when the impulse struck him, and the impulse struck often enough that his name was attached to projects and improvements across the island, and he could be vindictive when crossed, because a man who had spent 20 years fighting for everything he did not take kindly to opposition from men who had inherited theirs. He had a temper, he had opinions, and saw no reason to moderate them. He was not the kind of man who made enemies deliberately, but he was the kind of man who made them inevitably, because he operated in a world of money and power where the assertion of one man's will necessarily constrained another's, and Oakes was not inclined to soften the assertion. His wife, Eunice, Lady Oakes, was the quieter presence in the Westbourne household. Australian-born, married to Harry since 1923, she had borne the life of a mining magnate's wife with a steadiness that the social whirl of Nassau required but did not always reward. Westbourne itself was a substantial estate on the island, the kind of house that money builds in the tropics when money is not constrained by taste or convention. Large, comfortable, staffed, and situated within the tight geography of Nassau's white elite world, so that Government House, Bay Street, and the homes of the other wealthy residents were all within easy reach. It was a house of dinner parties and social obligations. Within 3 years of the Windsors' arrival, it would be a crime scene. Harry and Eunice's daughter Nancy had, by 1942, become one of the most talked about figures in Nassau's social world, and the talking was not all admiring. Nancy Oakes was young, attractive, independently minded, and possessed of the confidence that being the daughter of one of the richest men in the empire could provide. She had been educated abroad. She had seen more of the world than most young women of her age and station, and she was drawn to a man her father detested. Count Alfred de Marigny was a Mauritian of French extraction, twice divorced before the age of 35, charming in a way that was both his greatest asset and his most persistent liability, and possessed of a flamboyance that made him an easy object of suspicion in a colony whose social codes rewarded discretion and punished visibility. He was tall, striking, socially confident, and entirely comfortable in the company of people who did not trust him. He sailed. He entertained. He moved through Nassau's social world with the ease of a man who did not care whether he belonged, which in a community defined by belonging was either refreshing or intolerable, depending on who was watching. He was an outsider in a world of insiders. He was continental in a world of colonial British and American money. He had no fortune of his own that anyone considered sufficient, and his past and the 2 divorces, the peripatetic life, the undetermined sources of income, provided exactly the kind of material that a small gossip-fueled society could use to construct a character of almost any shape it pleased. Nancy had married him anyway, in 1942, at the age of 18. The marriage infuriated Harry Oakes with a depth and a persistence that surprised even those who knew him well. The fury was personal. The visceral rage of a self-made man watching his daughter choose a man he regarded as a fortune hunter and a fraud. But it was also social, because de Marigny's presence in the Oakes family disrupted the careful arrangements by which Nassau's elite world managed its internal relationships. Alfred was not one of them. He did not defer to Bay Street. He did not seek the approval of the men who ran the colony's commerce. He did not fit. And in a world as small and as enclosed as wartime Nassau, a man who did not fit was a man who attracted a particular kind of attention. The attention of people who might, under the right circumstances, find it useful to have someone to blame. That purpose, scapegoat, would arrive soon enough. But in the months before the murder, the de Marigny marriage functioned primarily as one more stress line running through a social world already dense with them. Oakes was angry at his daughter and contemptuous of her husband. Nancy was defiant in a way that combined youth, love, and the particular stubbornness of a rich man's child who has learned that her father's money does not entitle him to choose her life. Alfred was visible, unapologetic, and seemingly unaware or unconcerned that the hostility he attracted in certain quarters was not merely social disapproval, but something that could, under pressure, become considerably more dangerous. And the rest of Nassau's elite watched the family drama with the kind of attentive fascination that small, enclosed communities bring to the misfortunes and misjudgments of their most prominent members, storing details, forming opinions, waiting to see how the story would resolve itself. Meanwhile, the broader tensions of the colony continued to build beneath the surface of restored order. The unresolved aftermath of the riot sat beneath every official pronouncement and every social gathering like an unexploded charge. Cites the wartime economy continued to produce distortions that the colonial administration could manage administratively but not morally. American money flowing into construction projects, Bahamian workers leaving for the project and returning with wages and expectations that the local economy could not match. The cost of living rising while local wages remained anchored to pre-war assumption about what black labor was worth. The Bay Street merchants continued to operate as if the riot had been a weather event, destructive but temporary, requiring cleanup rather than structural change. And the population that had rioted continued to live in conditions that made a repeat of the violence not a question of whether but when. The intelligence file on the Duke continued to grow. The Foreign Office had not stopped worrying about Edward's judgment simply because the immediate crisis of 1942 had passed. The concern had merely shifted register from the acute anxiety of the Lisbon period and the Wenner-Gren embarrassment to a more chronic, lower-level unease about a governor whose instincts remained consistently poor and whose capacity for self-correction was, by this point, clearly non-existent. The Wenner-Gren matter remained a source of concern even after the Swedish industrialists' blacklisting, because the pattern it represented, the Duke's gravitational pull toward men who attracted official suspicion, was not a single episode but a character trait. And character traits do not resolve themselves through administrative action. Edward was still Edward. He was still a man who chose his companions on the basis of personal chemistry rather than political prudence, and who could not accept that the rules governing the friendships of a colonial governor in wartime were different from the rules governing the friendships of a private citizen at peace. Harold Christie, through all of this, remained the indispensable intermediary, the man who connected the Duke's official world to the colony's real one, who brokered the relationships that made governance possible, and who occupied a position within Nassau's network of money and influence so central that his removal would have left a hole the system could not easily fill. Christie was not a simple man, though his function in the colony sometimes made him appear so. He was a real estate developer by trade and a political operator by instinct, and the two activities fed each other in ways that were difficult to disentangle. He sold land, he facilitated deals, he sat in the colonial legislature, he knew who owed what to whom, and he understood, with the precision of a man who had spent his entire career in a small society, that the maintenance of relationships was the maintenance of power. His relationship with Oakes was particularly close and particularly layered. They were business associates. Christie had been instrumental in facilitating some of Oakes's land acquisitions on the island. They were social companions. They were, in the way that wealthy men in small societies become, something like partners in the management of the colony's economic life, their interests so thoroughly intertwined that any threat to one was, implicitly, a threat to the other. Christie knew Oakes's business. He knew his plans. He knew his frustrations and his enemies. And he would be, on the night of July 7th, 1943, one of the last people known to have been in Oakes's company before the murder, a fact that would generate questions Christie would spend the rest of his life attempting to answer. There was one other figure who needs to be placed into the pre-murder landscape because his role in what followed would be critical. Etienne Dupuche was the publisher and editor of the Nassau Daily Tribune, and he represented something that the colonial establishment generally preferred not to exist: an independent press voice with the courage and the stubbornness to publish what the authorities would rather suppress. Dupuche was Bahamian, politically engaged and not beholden to the Bay Street establishment in the way that most of the colony's public voices were. He had covered the riot. He had written about the colony's racial inequalities, and when the events of July 1943 produced a story that the governor's instinct was to contain, Dupuche would be the man who ensured that containment failed. His importance in the narrative is not as a detective or an investigator, but as the adversary of censorship. The proof that in even the smallest and most tightly controlled colonial world, there existed at least one person whose commitment to the truth was stronger than his fear of the men who wanted it hidden. The significance of this period, as the 12 months between the riot and the murder, Stoing, is not that anything dramatic happened. It is that nothing dramatic happened, and yet everything necessary for the catastrophe of July 1943 was quietly falling into place. The colony's racial wounds were unhealed. The governor's instincts were defensive and controlling. The elite circle was too small, too entangled, and too compromised by mutual dependence to withstand the kind of scrutiny that a serious criminal investigation would bring. And the man at the center of that circle's economic life, Harry Oakes, with his money, his temper, his enemies, and his place at the heart of the wartime Nassau's web of interest, was moving through the final months of his life without any awareness that those months were final. The relationship between Edward and Oakes in this period is worth dwelling on because it exemplified the broader dynamic that made Nassau's elite world so vulnerable to catastrophe. They needed each other, but they needed each other for reasons that neither could publicly acknowledge. Edward needed Oakes because the baronet's wealth and social gravity gave the governor's world a weight it would otherwise have lacked. A man of consequence, a man of substance, proof that the Bahamas were not merely a colonial dumping ground, but a place where serious people lived and serious money was managed. Oakes needed Edward because proximity to a former king, even a disgraced one, conferred a legitimacy that money alone could not purchase. The baronetcy was pleasant, but dining regularly with the man who had once been Edward VIII was something else entirely. The relationship was transactional beneath its social surface, and the transaction bound them together in ways that made independence impossible. If one man's reputation was damaged, the other's would be compromised. If one man's secrets were exposed, the exposure would inevitably reach the other's door. They were not accomplices in any criminal sense. They were something more structurally dangerous, men whose interests were so entangled that the truth about either one threatened the position of both. Multiply that dynamic across the entire elite circle. Christie, the Bay Street merchants, the wartime profiteers, the men whose business interests overlapped with their social relationships and whose social relationships overlapped with their political loyalties. And you begin to understand why the Bahamas of mid-1943 were a place where murder would be uniquely difficult to investigate honestly. The system was not designed for honesty. It was designed for the management of appearances, for the maintenance of hierarchy, and for the protection of the men at the top from the consequences of their own arrangements. An honest investigation would pull at threads that connected to every corner of the colony's power structure. An honest investigation would ask questions that the governor, the police, the merchants, and the property men did not want asked. An honest investigation would require the very transparency that the colony's entire system of governance was built to prevent. This is the critical understanding that the documentary must establish before the murder scene. The Bahamas by mid-1943 were a place where censorship was not only thinkable but practiced, where outside investigators could be imported at the governor's discretion and local ones sidelined, where elite men knew one another too intimately for any investigation to proceed without implicating the web of relationships that sustained them all, and where the official head of the colony had already demonstrated, through 2.5 years of poor instincts about loyalty, secrecy, and the management of information, that his first response to crisis would be control rather than clarity. If something terrible happened inside this circle, and something terrible was about to happen, the search for truth would be compromised from its very first hour. Not because anyone planned a cover up in advance, but because the entire system was built on the suppression of inconvenient reality, and murder is the most inconvenient reality of all. By early July 1943, the war had turned. The Allies were advancing in North Africa. Sicily was about to be invaded. The vast machinery of global conflict had moved past the defensive phase and into something that, for the first time, looked like it might end in victory. In Nassau, the war's improvement barely registered against the colony's internal tensions. The island was still poor, the racial order was still intact. The elite circle was still closed, and within that circle, Harry Oakes was still alive, dining, arguing, managing his money, pursuing his grudges, entertaining at Westbourne, occupying the position of wealth and force that he had built for himself over decades of relentless effort. On the evening of July the 7th, 1943, Harold Christie dined with Oakes at Westbourne. The meal was ordinary. The conversation, as far as anyone later reported, was unremarkable. The kind of evening that wealthy men in a small colony had shared hundreds of times before, lubricated by the easy familiarity of men who saw each other regularly and discussed the same limited range of subjects: property, business, the war, the colony's affairs, the social minutiae of an island where everyone's business was, to some degree, everyone else's. Christie later said he stayed the night at Westbourne, sleeping in a guest room. The evening was warm, Nassau in July, the heavy tropical air of midsummer pressing against the windows, the sound of the sea somewhere beyond the grounds. The war was far away, the colony's secrets were close. Lady Oakes was not at Westbourne that night. She was in the United States. Nancy was also away. The house was quiet, or should have been quiet. The staff had retired, Christie had gone to his room, and Harry Oakes, 68 years old, one of the richest men in the British Empire, a self-made fortune built over decades of physical hardship and relentless will, lay down in his own bedroom in a house he owned on an island where his money made him untouchable. At some point during the night that followed, Sir Harry Oakes was murdered. His body would be found the next morning in circumstances so grotesque, so bizarre, and so deliberately staged that the crime would resist explanation for decades. The bedroom would show signs of intense localized burning. The body would bear injuries that pathologists and investigators would argue about for years. The scene would have a quality not just of violence, but of arrangement, something performed, something intended to send a message or to obscure one, something that went beyond the mechanics of killing into a territory that suggested either ritual, rage, or the calculated destruction of evidence. And the first person outside the household to assert control over the response, the man who would decide who investigated, who was informed, and how the information flowed, would not be a detective or a magistrate or an officer of Scotland Yard. It would be the governor of the Bahamas, the former King of England, a man who had spent his entire life reaching in moments of crisis, not for the truth, but for the levers of control. The island's ugliest secrets were now concentrated in one room, in one dead man's house, inside the most tightly sealed social circle in the colonial Caribbean. And the man who held formal responsibility for uncovering the truth was the man whose entire system of governance depended on the truth staying buried. The morning of July 8th, 1943, began with Harold Christie raising the alarm. The accounts of exactly how and when the body was discovered would later become a subject of intense scrutiny. But the basic facts were these. Christie, who had stayed the night at Westbourne as a guest, entered or approached Harry Oakes's bedroom in the early hours and found him dead. The scene that confronted him, and that would confront everyone who entered that room in the hours that followed, was not merely violent. It was bizarre in a way that seemed almost calculated to resist interpretation. Oakes lay on his bed. He had been struck multiple times about the head, blows severe enough to fracture his skull in several places, delivered with a force that suggested either a weapon or an instrument wielded with extraordinary violence. His body showed evidence of burning, not the comprehensive burning of a fire set to destroy evidence, but something more selective, more disturbing, as if the fire had been applied to the body rather than to the room. Parts of the bedroom had been set alight, and the burning had partially consumed the mattress and bedding, but the fire had not spread to the rest of the house. It had been contained, or it had burned out, or it had been set with a purpose that did not include the destruction of the building. And then there were the feathers. A pillow had been ripped open, deliberately, violently, and the feathers scattered over the body, where they had adhered to the burned and bloodied skin, creating an image so grotesque and so strange that it seemed less like the aftermath of a killing than the staging of a tableau. The feathers gave the scene a quality that every investigator who entered the room noted and none could adequately explain. A quality of ritual, of deliberate desecration, of something that went beyond the mechanics of murder into a territory that suggested rage so extreme it had become theatrical, or calculation so cold it had become symbolic. The mattress had been scorched, an insecticide sprayer, a flit gun, the standard household pest control device of the aura, was found nearby, apparently used to accelerate the fire. The combination of blunt force trauma, burning, and the feathers created a crime scene that defied easy classification. This was not a burglary interrupted. It was not a professional killing executed with the economy of means that professional killers typically employed. It was not a crime of sudden passion committed with whatever weapon came to hand and then abandoned in panic. It was something else, something that combined extreme violence with a degree of post-mortem attention that suggested the killer or killers had remained in the room after the death, had taken deliberate steps to alter the body and the scene, and had then departed without disturbing the rest of the house. No signs of forced entry were found, no indication that anyone outside the household had breached Westbourne's grounds, no evidence of the kind of violent intrusion that a stranger's assault on one of the richest men in the British Empire should logically have produced. The house was quiet, the grounds were undisturbed, and Harry Oakes was dead in his own bed, in a room that looked as if someone had taken considerable care to make his death not merely final, but unforgettable. Christie's account of his own movements that night would become one of the most contested elements of the case. He said he had slept through the night in a guest bedroom and discovered the body in the morning. Others would later challenge this. Witnesses reported seeing a vehicle at the estate during the night. Christie's own demeanor in the hours after the discovery struck some observers as inconsistent with the shock of a man who had stumbled onto the murdered body of a close friend. These observations would accumulate over the years into a body of suspicion that never quite produced proof, but never quite dissolved into irrelevance either. Christie was not charged. He was never formally accused. But the questions about what he knew, what he saw, and what he did during the night of July 7th would follow him for the rest of his life and would become one of the enduring mysteries of the case. What happened next, in the first hours after the discovery, is the sequence that defines Edward's place in this story more precisely than any other. It is the moment when every characteristic, the documentary, has spent 3 acts establishing converges into a single, devastating pattern of behavior. The Duke of Windsor was informed of the murder early on the morning of July 8th. His response was immediate, and it was not the response of a governor whose instinct was to seek the truth. It was the response of a man whose instinct was to control the flow of information. The same instinct he had displayed with the censorship apparatus, the same instinct that had shaped his approach to every threat, every embarrassment, and every crisis throughout his time in Nassau. The former king reached for the levers of power, and the levers he reached for were the levers of containment. Edward moved to suppress public knowledge of the murder. He attempted to impose censorship on reporting of the crime, an impulse that, in a colony where the governor held wartime emergency powers and where the censorship apparatus was already in place and already familiar to a governor who had made personal use of it, was not merely theoretical but practically achievable, at least in the short term. The logic, insofar as it can be reconstructed from the accounts of those involved and the decisions that followed, was the logic of a man who had spent his entire adult life managing the gap between public image and private reality. The murder of one of the colony's most prominent residents, inside the governor's own social circle, in a house where the governor had dined, involving people the governor knew personally. This was exactly the kind of event that Edward's instincts told him must be controlled before it could be understood. He did not reach first for the truth. He reached first for the instruments of narrative management he wanted the story contained. He wanted the investigation channel. He wanted, above all, to determine the frame before anyone else could impose one. The impulse toward censorship was revealing enough. But it was the next decision, the decision about who would investigate the murder, that would prove truly devastating. Or rather than requesting assistance from Scotland Yard, the normal, expected, procedurally correct route for a serious criminal investigation in a British colonial territory, and the route that any competent governor with nothing to hide would have followed without hesitation, Edward bypassed the established system entirely and contacted the Miami police. He reached across the Florida Strait to a foreign jurisdiction and asked for detectives to be sent to Nassau to investigate the murder of a British baronet on British colonial soil. The men who arrived were Captain Edward Melshon and Captain James Barker of the Miami Police Department, and their involvement in the case would prove catastrophic. Not because they were corrupt in any simple sense, but because their presence transformed the investigation from the outset into something that operated outside the normal chains of authority, accountability, and professional oversight that a Scotland Yard inquiry would have imposed. The decision to bring in Miami detectives rather than Scotland Yard investigators has never been satisfactorily explained. Edward's defenders have argued that Miami was closer, that speed was essential, and that the Duke had personal connections to the Miami force from his visits to Florida. His critics, and they are more numerous and more persuasive, have argued that the decision was precisely what it appeared to be: the act of a man who wanted investigators he could influence rather than investigators who would operate independently. Scotland Yard detectives answering to London would have conducted an investigation that the governor could not control. Miami detectives operating in a foreign jurisdiction on the personal invitation of a colonial governor were in a fundamentally different position, dependent on the Duke's cooperation, unfamiliar with local conditions, and potentially susceptible to the kind of pressure that a man of Edward's status and instincts was capable of applying. Whatever Edward's precise reasoning, the consequences were clear almost immediately. Melchon and Barker arrived in Nassau and took charge of a crime scene that had already been compromised by the passage of time, the movement of people through the house, and the absence of the kind of forensic discipline that a Scotland Yard team would have imposed from the first hour. The Miami detectives were not incompetent in the ordinary sense. They were competent men operating in an extraordinary situation, a colonial murder investigation in a jurisdiction they did not know, under the authority of a governor whose motives they had no reason to question and every reason to accommodate, in a social world so small and so interconnected that the standard procedures of criminal investigation were almost impossible to apply without touching the interests of the most powerful people on the island. The investigation moved quickly toward a suspect, and the suspect it moved toward was Alfred de Marigny. The speed of the focus was itself significant. In a case where the crime scene was bizarre, the victim was embedded in a dense web of financial and social relationships, and the list of people who might have had reason to want Harry Oakes dead could plausibly have included business rivals, criminal interests attracted by his wealth, local figures with grudges, and associates whose own affairs would not have survived scrutiny. In a case, in other words, where the field of inquiry should have been wide, the investigation narrowed almost immediately to a single man. And the man it narrowed to was the one man in Nassau's elite world who had the least protection. The logic was, on the surface, straightforward enough. De Marigny had motive, or at least the appearance of motive. His relationship with his father-in-law had been hostile and publicly so. Oakes had disapproved of the marriage with a vehemence that was well known across the island. There had been friction, arguments, the kind of family animosity that, viewed from the outside and with sufficient prosecutorial will, could be shaped into a narrative of escalating conflict leading to violence. De Marigny was an outsider. He was flamboyant in a colony that punished flamboyance. He was foreign in a world of British colonials and American money. He had no powerful friends, no Bay Street allies, no institutional support within the colony's establishment. He was, in every social sense, the person the system could most easily blame. The man who did not belong, the man whose presence in Nassau's elite world had always been tolerated rather than welcomed, the man whose conviction would cause the least disruption to the remaining relationships and whose removal from the story would allow the colony's power structure to close ranks and resume its normal operations without further embarrassment. De Marigny was arrested and charged with the murder of Sir Harry Oakes. The arrest was swift. The case against him rested in significant part on a single piece of physical evidence, a fingerprint allegedly belonging to de Marigny, found on a lacquered Chinese screen in Oakes's bedroom. Captain James Barker, the Miami detective, had lifted the print. He presented it as proof that de Marigny had been at the scene of the crime. It was the prosecution's most important piece of evidence, and it would, under cross-examination at trial, come apart in a way that destroyed not only the case against de Marigny, but the credibility of the entire investigation. The trial of Alfred de Marigny for the murder of Sir Harry Oakes opened in Nassau in October 1943 and ran into November. It was, by any measure, the most sensational criminal proceeding the Bahamas had ever seen. The courtroom was packed. The press, despite the governor's efforts at suppression, and was paying attention. And the evidence was being subjected to the kind of adversarial scrutiny that the investigation itself had never received. The fingerprint was the turning point. Under cross-examination by Godfrey Higgs, de Marigny's defense attorney, a Bahamian lawyer whose performance in this trial would be remembered as one of the most effective pieces of courtroom advocacy the colony had ever witnessed, the Miami detective Barker was forced to confront a series of devastating questions about the provenance and integrity of the print he had presented as the prosecution's cornerstone evidence. Higgs's cross-examination was methodical and lethal. He established step by step that the fingerprint had not been photographed in situ. That is, Barker had not taken a photograph showing the fingerprint on the surface of the Chinese screen in the context of the crime scene before lifting it. This was not a minor procedural oversight. It was a fundamental departure from standard forensic practice. The entire purpose of photographing a print before lifting it is to create an independent, verifiable record that the print was found where the investigator claims it was found. Without that photograph, the chain of evidence was broken. There was no way to prove, independently of Barker's own testimony, that the print had actually been on the screen. The absence meant that there was no independent verification that the print had been found where Barker said it had been found. And the implication, which Higgs drew out with devastating patience, was explosive. The fingerprint might have been planted. It might have been lifted from another surface entirely. A glass de Marigny had held at a dinner party, a railing he had gripped, any object he had touched in the normal course of social life in a colony where everyone knew everyone and everyone handled the same glasses and doorknobs and furniture, and then transferred to the screen in Oakes's bedroom to create the appearance of evidence that did not organically exist. Higgs pushed further. He questioned Barker about the handling of other prints at the scene. He noted inconsistencies in the detective's testimony about when and how the print had been lifted. He pointed out that Barker's own fingerprint lifting technique, as described in his testimony, was inconsistent with the physical characteristics of the print as presented. The cumulative effect was devastating. By the time Higgs finished his cross-examination, the fingerprint, the prosecution's single most important piece of physical evidence, had been transformed from proof of guilt into evidence of potential misconduct by the investigators themselves. Barker denied the allegation of planting. He maintained that the print had been found where he said it was found. But the damage was done, and it was irreparable. The defense had not merely challenged the evidence, it had challenged the integrity of the investigation itself. And once that challenge was in the air, once the possibility had been raised in open court that the primary physical evidence against the accused had been fabricated by the man who presented it, the prosecution's case began to collapse. The trial produced other revelation that deepened the sense of a compromised investigation and a community too entangled for honest justice. Witnesses contradicted one another. Accounts of movements on the night of the murder did not align. Christie's testimony about his own actions was challenged. The broader question of who might have had reason to want Harry Oakes dead, a question that, honestly pursued, would have led into the deepest financial and political networks of the colony, was never fully explored because fully exploring it would have required the investigation to turn its attention toward the very people who had the most power and the most to protect. Nancy Oakes de Marigny emerged during the trial as one of the story's most compelling figures, not because she solved the mystery, but because she refused to participate in the narrative the prosecution had constructed. She stood by her husband. She stood by him publicly, visibly, and with a conviction that cost her the support of much of Nassau's establishment and placed her in direct opposition to the official machinery that was attempting to convict him. Her loyalty was not naive. She had seen her father's world from the inside. She knew the men who populated it, the relationships that sustained it, and the calculations that governed it. And she chose Alfred, chose to believe in his innocence, chose to support his defense, chose to place herself on the opposite side of the line from the governor, the police, and the social world in which she had been raised. It was an act of personal courage that the documentary should render with the weight it deserves because it converts the murder from an abstract scandal into a human story. A daughter mourning her father while defending the man accused of killing him. A young woman making a choice that the entire power structure of the island opposed. Throughout the trial, one man was conspicuously absent. The Duke of Windsor, the governor who had been informed of the murder first, who had attempted to censor the news, who had bypassed Scotland Yard in favor of Miami detectives, who had presided over the investigation from its inception, was not in Nassau for the proceedings. He had left the island. He could not be called as a witness. The timing of his departure has been the subject of speculation ever since, and the speculation is not unreasonable. The man whose decisions had shaped the investigation from its first hour was nowhere near the courtroom when those decisions were subjected to public scrutiny. His absence was narratively perfect in a way that almost defied fiction. The former king was central enough to the story to have determined its direction, but elusive enough to avoid answering for its failures. He had set the machinery in motion and then removed himself from the room where the machinery was being dismantled. Etienne Dupuch, the publisher of the Nassau Daily Tribune, played a critical role in ensuring that the trial and the questions it raised reached a public audience. The governor's early attempts at censorship had failed in part because Dupuch refused to comply, and in part because a murder this sensational in a colony this small could not be suppressed by administrative fiat, no matter how powerful the administrator. Dupuch kept the case alive in print. He reported on the trial. He raised the questions that the official investigation had failed to pursue. He was not an investigator and did not claim to be one, but he was something the colony's power structure found almost as threatening. A man with a printing press and a refusal to be silenced. His role in the story is the proof that even in the most tightly controlled colonial environment, the impulse toward truth could not be entirely extinguished. It could be delayed, obstructed, and marginalized, but it could not be killed. Because somewhere there was always a man stubborn enough to keep asking the questions that the men in power did not want asked. On November 12, 1943, the jury delivered its verdict. Alfred de Marigny was acquitted of the murder of Sir Harry Oakes. The verdict came after several hours of deliberation, and it was received in a courtroom whose atmosphere had shifted over the weeks of testimony from the certainty of a foregone conclusion to something closer to collective unease. The prosecution had entered the trial expecting conviction. It left the courtroom having failed to prove its case in a manner so public and so comprehensive that the failure itself became the story. The acquittal was not a declaration of innocence in the moral or evidentiary sense. The jury did not say that de Marigny was innocent. It said that the Crown had not proved its case beyond reasonable doubt, that the evidence presented was insufficient, that the fingerprint was fatally compromised, that the investigation had been conducted so poorly and so irregularly that no honest jury could convict on the basis of what the prosecution had managed to produce. The distinction mattered legally but barely registered publicly. What the public understood, what Nassau understood, what the press understood, what the colonial administration understood was that the case had collapsed, and that it had collapsed because the investigation from which it sprang had been compromised from its first hours by decisions made at the very top of the colony's authority. The jury added the recommendation that de Marigny be deported from the Bahamas, a coda that reflected the colony's deep ambivalence toward a man it had tried to convict and fail. The recommendation had no legal force, but its message was unmistakable. Nassau did not want Alfred de Marigny. It could not prove he was a murderer, but it could make clear that his continued presence on the island was unwelcome. If the establishment could not imprison him, it could at least exile him, an irony lost on no one, given that exile was the colony's defining relationship with the man who governed it. De Marigny left Nassau. Nancy left with him. Their departure together was itself a kind of verdict, not on the murder, but on the colony that had tried and failed to use her husband as a sacrifice to protect its own. They were leaving a place that had attempted to convict an outsider to shield its insiders, and they were leaving because the place, even in acquittal, had made clear that Alfred de Marigny would never be permitted to exist within its walls without suspicion. Nancy's choice to go with him, to choose her husband over her father's world, over the establishment that had raised her, over the money and the position and the social machinery of colonial Nassau, was the final human note in the trial's aftermath. It was a daughter's judgment on the world that had killed her father, and then, in her estimation, botched the search for justice so badly that the real killer walked free, while an innocent man was nearly destroyed. The murder of Sir Harry Oakes remained unsolved. It remains unsolved today. No one else was ever charged. No subsequent investigation produced a conviction or a confession or a deathbed revelation that settled the matter. The case passed from the realm of active criminal investigation into the realm of historical mystery, and in that realm it has been endlessly revisited by writers, journalists, documentary makers, and amateur investigators who have produced a library of competing theories without arriving at a conclusion that commands anything close to consensus. The theories implicate different people and invoke different motives. Some point to organized crime, to the possibility that American mob interests, attracted by the prospect of casino gambling in the Bahamas and frustrated by Oakes's opposition to their plans, arranged the killing through intermediaries. Some focus on local figures, on business disputes, land deals, financial arrangements gone wrong, the kind of commercial grievances that in a colony where money and power were so closely entwined could generate motives that the official investigation never explored, because exploring them would have led into territory the colony's establishment could not afford to illuminate. Some theories circle back to Christie, to the unanswered questions about his movements on the night of the murder, his proximity to the victim, and his position at the center of the colony's web of financial interest. Some point further toward figures and networks whose involvement remains speculative and whose alleged motives depend on readings of the evidence that other investigators dispute. What none of the theories dispute, what no serious examination of the case has ever disputed, is the central fact that the investigation was compromised from its first hours by the decisions of the governor, and that the governor's decisions reflected not a commitment to justice, but a commitment to the management of consequence. The Duke of Windsor's role in the Oakes case is not in the end a mystery. It is something worse than a mystery. It is a pattern made visible. The man who had avoided the obligations of kingship, who had chosen personal desire over institutional duty, who had drifted toward dangerous friendships and resisted every form of accountability the system tried to impose, behaved in the Oakes investigation exactly as his entire life predicted he would behave. He reached for control. He bypassed the proper channels. He chose investigators he could manage over investigators who would operate independently. He attempted to suppress information. He absented himself when the consequences of his decisions were examined in public. And when the case collapsed, and when the fingerprint was challenged, when the prosecution failed, when the acquittal exposed the investigation as inadequate at best and corrupt at worst, he offered no explanation, no accountability, and no acknowledgement that the decisions he had made in the first hours after the murder had determined the case's outcome as surely as the murder itself. That silence, the silence of a man who had once commanded the attention of the entire empire and who now could not bring himself to answer for his conduct in a colonial murder investigation, is one of the most damning details in the entire story. It is not the silence of a man who has nothing to say. It is the silence of a man who has calculated that saying nothing is safer than saying anything, because anything he said would invite the next question, and the next question would lead to places he could not afford to go. The trial was over. The acquittal was recorded. The murderer was not named and would never be named. The colony that had witnessed the spectacle returned to its routines. The Bay Street shops, the harbor, the dinners, the wartime economy, the racial hierarchy, the quiet hum of a society that had been exposed and had chosen, collectively, not to examine what the exposure revealed. And the former king remained governor. He had presided over a colonial riot that killed 2 people. He had presided over a murder investigation that had been discredited in open court. He had demonstrated in every crisis the same set of instincts: control first, truth never. And the institution that had sent him to the Bahamas, the monarchy, the government, the elaborate machinery of British imperial administration, had watched it all happen and done nothing, because doing something would have required acknowledging that the containment strategy had failed. And acknowledging failure was not something the British establishment of 1943 was prepared to do about a former king, even one as manifestly inadequate as Edward. The Oakes case was closed without resolution. But it was not over. It would never be over. Because the murder, the investigation, and the trial had fused every element of the Bahamas story into a single, indelible image: a dead man in a rich man's house, a compromised investigation run by imported detectives, a fingerprint that might have been planted, a governor who chose control over truth, and a colony whose entire power structure had been x-rayed by the light of a crime it could not solve and would not honestly examine. The acquittal resolved nothing. The real killer was not named. The former king did not explain himself, and the case would linger for decades. Not because new evidence kept emerging, but because the story had become larger than one murder. It had become the X-ray of Edward's exile, the image that showed with clinical precision what lay beneath the tropical surface of a posting that was supposed to be the end of his scandal and had instead become its most damning chapter. After the trial, the Bahamas did not change. That was, in some ways, the most telling detail of all. The murder of one of the colony's richest men, the arrest and sensational acquittal of the prime suspect, the public exposure of a compromised investigation ordered by the governor himself. All of this had unfolded in the full light of press attention, courtroom scrutiny, and international curiosity, and when it was over, the colony simply resumed its routines. The Bay Street shops reopened. The harbor traffic continued, the dinner parties at Government House went on, the racial hierarchy remained intact, the war continued, and the Duke of Windsor remained governor. He would remain governor for nearly 2 more years. His tenure continued through 1944 and into 1945, and the character of that remaining period was defined less by dramatic events than by the slow, grinding accumulation of a posting that had exhausted whatever purpose it might once have claimed. The moral drama of Edward's governorship was effectively over by November 1943. The riot had demonstrated his limitations as a colonial administrator. The Oaks investigation had demonstrated his instincts as a man. The trial had demonstrated the consequences of those instincts in the most public and humiliating way possible. What remained was aftermath. The administrative tail end of a governorship that had been conceived as containment and had instead become an exhibition of the very qualities the containment was supposed to suppress. The colony Edward continued to govern was, after the trial, a place where the official narrative and the lived reality had permanently and irreconcilably separated. Everyone in Nassau who mattered knew the Oaks investigation had been mishandled. Everyone knew the governor had bypassed Scotland Yard in favor of American detectives he could manage. Everyone knew the fingerprint evidence had been discredited in open court by a defense attorney whose cross-examination had been so devastating that it effectively indicted the investigators rather than the accused. And everyone knew, with the quiet, shared certainty of a community too small for secrets and too invested in its own stability for confrontation, that no further investigation was going to be conducted. The case would remain unsolved. The questions would remain unanswered. The colony would proceed as if the most sensational murder in its history had been not a crisis demanding resolution, but an embarrassment requiring burial. The unspoken compact was simple: do not ask, do not look, do not pursue. Move forward. The compact held because the men with the power to break it were the same men with the most to lose from its breaking, and because the men without power, the black Bahamian majority, the workers who had rioted and been shot, the population whose experience of the colony bore no resemblance to the world of Westbourne and Government House, had never been consulted about the compact in the first place, and would not have been listened to if they had. Edward, through this final stretch, continued to behave as he had always behaved. He performed the duties of the office with intermittent attention and persistent resentment. He complained about the posting. He nursed his grievances about Wallace's title, about the family's treatment of them, about the smallness of the stage he had been given. He continued to socialize within the same elite circle that the Oaks case had exposed and that the trial had failed to penetrate. And he waited for the war to end, waited for the posting to conclude, waited for the return to Europe that he and Wallace both craved with an intensity that had only sharpened over 4.5 years of tropical exile. Wallace, in these final months, was performing the same calculations she had been performing since their arrival: how to endure with dignity a situation that offered no dignity, how to maintain the surfaces of a life that had long since lost its substance, how to manage a husband whose emotional needs had not diminished and whose capacity for self-pity had, if anything, increased with each year of the posting. She was tired. The photographs from the later Bahamas years show it, not dramatically, not in any way that would have been visible to a casual observer, but in the subtle flattening of expression that comes from sustained performance without rest. She had been managing Edward, managing the household, managing the social world, and managing her own disappointment for nearly 5 years. The Bahamas had given her nothing she wanted and taken from her the years of European life she had expected the abdication to provide. The couple who had once been the most glamorous exiles in the world were now merely stranded, marooned on an island they despised, presiding over a society they did not respect, carrying between them a weight of grievance, failure, and unexamined complicity that neither would ever fully acknowledge. Edward's governorship ended in 1945 with the conclusion of the war that had been the original justification for the posting. The couple left Nassau and did not return. The departure was quiet. That's no grand farewell ceremony, no valedictory address commensurate with the drama the posting had contained, no public reckoning with the record of the preceding 5 years. They simply left as if the Bahamas had been what the palace had always claimed they were: a minor colonial appointment, a wartime duty fulfilled, a chapter closed. But the chapter was not closed, and what the Bahamas had contained could not be packed away with the luggage. The posting had been, for nearly 5 years, the place where the abdication's consequences were supposed to be safely quarantined. Instead, it had become the place where those consequences were most vividly, most extensively, and most damagingly displayed. Every flaw the institution had tried to exile, the poor judgment, the dangerous friendships, the appetite for control, the inability to distinguish private interest from public obligation, the racial assumptions, the moral blindness that had not been neutralized by geographic distance. They had been concentrated by it. The smaller stage had produced not smaller consequences, but a density of failure that a larger posting might have diffused. And the cost of that failure was not borne by the man who failed. It was borne by the colony. The workers who rioted for fair wages and were answered with gunfire carried the cost. The community whose most sensational murder was bungled by a governor who chose control over justice carried the cost. The black Bahamian population that lived beneath a colonial hierarchy, the governor did nothing to reform and everything to maintain carried the cost. And the island itself, whose real history, real struggles, and real people were overshadowed for decades by the glamour of the famous couple who despised living there, carried a cost that is still being accounted for in the way the Bahamas period is remembered and told. The romance myth, the woman I love, the sacrifice, the idea of a king who chose his heart over his crown, had been tested against the reality of what Edward actually did when given genuine responsibility. And the reality had been devastating, not because he was evil, not because he was a traitor in any simple or provable sense, but because he was inadequate. Inadequate to the demands of governance, inadequate to the moral complexity of a colonial society in crisis, inadequate to the basic obligation of a man in authority to pursue truth over comfort and justice over self-protection. The Bahamas revealed him. That was their function in the story, and it was a function he never understood and never would. After the Bahamas, Edward and Wallace returned to Europe and began the long final act of their shared exile. They settled in France, first in temporary arrangements, then in the house in the Bois de Boulogne on the outskirts of Paris that the French government provided at a nominal rent and that became their permanent home for the remaining decades of their lives. The house was large, staffed, immaculately maintained, and surrounded by the kind of formal gardens that provided a visual setting for the couple's continued performance of a life that had lost its audience, but not its choreography. The post-war decades were, in their way, as revealing as the wartime years, though the revelation was quieter and slower and lacked the dramatic punctuation of riots and murders. The couple lived in a kind of permanent social exile that mirrored their political one. They were famous, they were invited to parties, they appeared at galas and charity events and society dinners across Europe and America. They were photographed constantly, Wallace in her Givenchy and her Dior, Edward in the impeccable tailoring that had always been his one unassailable competence, the two of them performing endlessly performing, the role of a couple whose love had justified a king's abdication and whose life together was therefore obligated, at every public moment, to look as though it had been worth the price. But the performance was increasingly hollow, and the audience was increasingly indifferent. The post-war world had moved on. The abdication, which had seemed so shattering in 1936, had been overtaken by the war, by the emergence of the Cold War, by decolonization, by the social revolutions of the 1960s, and by the arrival of a younger generation of royals who made Edward's pre-war drama seem as distant as the Edwardian era from which his name derived. The couple occupied a peculiar social position, still famous enough to attract attention, still wealthy enough to live well, still connected enough to appear at the right events, but fundamentally irrelevant to anything that mattered. They were celebrities without a cause. They were exiles without a constituency. They were, in the end, a couple whose story had peaked in 1936 and who had spent the intervening decades trying to convince the world, and perhaps themselves, that the sequel was worth watching. George VI had proved himself during the war in ways that made the comparison with Edward not merely unfavorable, but annihilating. He had stayed in London during the Blitz. He had visited bomb sites while the rubble was still smoking. He had stood in the ruins of buildings and spoken to people who had lost their homes, their livelihoods, and their families. And he had done it not with Edward's easy charm, but with something more valuable and more difficult: the visible, awkward, unperformable sincerity of a man who was frightened, but who showed up anyway, because showing up was what the crown demanded. The stammer that had been his private torment became, during the war years, an inadvertent emblem of authenticity, proof that the man speaking was not performing ease but overcoming difficulty, and that the effort was itself a form of service. When George II died in February 1952, at the age of 56, worn out by the stress of a reign he had never sought and the smoking that had become one of his few private consolations, the nation mourned a king who had embodied everything his brother had refused. The contrast with Edward, alive, healthy, lounging in France, attending parties, negotiating his allowance, complaining about his wife's title, was never stated explicitly in the official tributes. It did not need to be. Everyone who knew the story understood what it meant. The brother who stayed had given his health and ultimately his life to the role. The brother who left had given nothing except an example of what the monarchy must never again allow. Elizabeth, George's daughter, became queen at 25. The monarchy continued. The Windsor line ran through the brother who had endured, not the brother who had fled. Edward's branch was severed, not by formal exclusion, but by the simple, irreversible fact that he had produced no children, left no heir, and contributed nothing to the institution's continuity except a cautionary tale and a permanent anxiety about what might have happened had the abdication not occurred, and a man of Edward's character been sitting on the throne of England during the greatest war in human history. The relationship between Edward and the palace in the post-war decades was defined by a kind of permanent, low-grade hostility managed through the language of protocol and conducted at a temperature just below the threshold of public rupture. Edward wanted recognition. He wanted Wallis to receive the HRH title that had been withheld since 1937 and whose absence he experienced as a daily insult to her and to the sacrifice he believed he had made. He wanted a role, however nominal, within the family's official life. An invitation, an acknowledgement, some gesture that would signal his rehabilitation and confirm that the exile had been penance enough. The palace, guided by the Queen Mother's enduring and implacable hostility toward the couple, and by a broader institutional calculation that Edward and Wallis were more useful as a cautionary lesson than as reconciled family members, gave him almost nothing. There were occasional meetings, stiff and formal. There were exchanges of letters, whose civility barely concealed their coldness. There were the ongoing negotiations of money and allowances that continued to the end of Edward's life, and that carried beneath their financial surface the deeper question of what the family owed a man who had abandoned it and what a man who had abandoned it was entitled to claim. But there was never warmth. There was never genuine reconciliation, And there was never the acknowledgement of his sacrifice, of his suffering, of his fundamental rightness that Edward spent his remaining years believing he was owed, and that the institution spent those same years quietly refusing to provide. He grew old in Paris. The restlessness of his youth, the tours, the nightclubs, the constant movement that had once given his life its energy and its danger hardened into routine. The charm that had captivated crowds on 4 continents became the social manner of an elderly man repeating the same anecdotes at the same parties to audiences who had heard them before and who attended less out of fascination than out of the particular social inertia that sustains the famous long after the fame has outlived its cause. He gardened, he played golf, he walked his pugs, he dressed with the same meticulous attention he had always brought to his appearance, as if the perfection of a Windsor knot or the drape of a jacket might compensate for the imperfection of everything else. He wrote, or had ghostwritten, a memoir published in 1951 that attempted to frame the abdication as a noble act and the subsequent years as dignified exile, a framing that required the strategic omission of virtually everything that had happened in the Bahamas and the careful avoidance of any detail that might have invited the reader to look more closely at the wartime years. He did not discuss the Oaks case publicly, not in the memoir, not in interviews, not in the social conversations that filled his evenings. He did not discuss the riot. He did not discuss the intelligence files, the Venner-Gren friendship, the censorship, the imported detectives, the fingerprint that was challenged in open court, or any of the specific failures that had defined his governorship and that, had they been examined honestly, would have destroyed what remained of the romantic narrative on which his public identity depended. The silence he had maintained since the trial in 1943 extended across the remaining 3 decades of his life, hardening from discretion into a permanent, structural refusal to engage with the parts of his own story that reflected most poorly on his character. It was not the silence of a man who had forgotten. It was the silence of a man who had calculated, correctly as it turned out, for as long as he lived, that the romantic version of the story was preferable to the truthful one, and that maintaining the romance required never speaking about Nassau in any way that invited scrutiny. Edward, Duke of Windsor, died in Paris on May 28, 1972. He was 77 years old. He had been ill for some time, throat cancer, the consequence of a lifetime of smoking. His body was returned to England and buried at Frogmore, in the grounds of Windsor Castle, the family estate whose name he bore and whose obligation he had abandoned 36 years earlier. Queen Elizabeth visited him shortly before his death, a meeting that was widely reported and widely interpreted as a gesture of familial reconciliation, though whether it represented genuine warmth or institutional stage management was, as with so much in Edward's life, impossible to determine from the outside. The funeral was attended by the royal family. The honors were those due to a former sovereign, which was technically correct and emotionally complicated because the honors acknowledged the rank he had held while leaving entirely unaddressed the question of what he had done with it and what he had failed to do. Wallis survived him by 14 years. She lived on in the Paris house, increasingly frail, increasingly isolated, and increasingly the object of a particular kind of public fascination that attaches to figures whose story has become larger than their person and whose person has become smaller than their legend. She was cared for by a diminishing circle of staff and acquaintances. The sharp social intelligence that had once made her the most compelling woman in any room she entered, the wit, the precision, the instinct for the dynamics of a social gathering, faded into the diminishment of age and in her final years the confusion of dementia. The woman who had once navigated the most dangerous drawing rooms in Europe could no longer navigate her own house. She died on April 24th, 1986, at the age of 89. She was buried beside Edward at Frogmore, the couple who had caused the greatest constitutional crisis of the 20th century and had spent the subsequent 50 years trying to justify it, or at least trying to make it look justified, lay together in the grounds of the castle that represented everything Edward had surrendered and everything Wallis had been denied. Their branch of the Windsor line ended with them. No children, no heirs, no continuation. The dynasty flowed through George VI, through Elizabeth, through her children and grandchildren, through the institution that had absorbed the shock of the abdication and rebuilt itself around the principle that Edward had violated, that the crown was not a personal possession to be discarded when it became inconvenient, but a public trust to be maintained at the cost of private desire. Edward's legacy within the family was not succession, but disturbance. He was the wound that never fully closed, the cautionary example that every subsequent generation of Windsors was raised with, even if the example was never spoken aloud in its full detail. The monarchy that survived him, that survived the abdication, the war, the post-war transformation of Britain, the dissolution of the empire, and the endless modern pressures of media scrutiny, survived in part because it had absorbed the lesson Edward's failure taught, that the crown was not a personal possession to be discarded when it became inconvenient, but a public trust to be maintained at the cost of private desire. Whether individual members of the family internalized that lesson with equal conviction is a question the subsequent decades have answered in varying ways. But the lesson itself, encoded in the institution's DNA by the shock of 1936 and reinforced by the revelations of the wartime years, remained the foundation on which the modern monarchy was built. Edward's contribution to that foundation was entirely negative. He showed what the institution must never again permit. That was his legacy, and it was in the end more durable than anything he ever chose to give. For the oak's thread, the conclusion is irresolution. And irresolution in this story is not a narrative weakness, but the narrative point. The murder of Sir Harry Oakes has never been solved. No one was ever convicted. The competing theories continue to circulate in books, articles, and documentary treatments, each offering a different configuration of the same fragmentary evidence, and each failing to produce the kind of certainty that would close the case permanently. The theories will continue because the case sits at a junction where money, class, colonial power, and compromised authority converge. And at that junction, the truth was buried so early and so thoroughly, by the governor's decisions, by the investigation's failures, by the colony's institutional reluctance to examine itself, that recovery may be genuinely impossible. The case is not unsolved because the evidence was insufficient. It is unsolved because the system that was supposed to gather the evidence was the same system that had the most to lose from what the evidence might reveal. The investigation was compromised at birth. What followed was not a search for truth, but a performance of one, and the performance failed in public, and the failure became the permanent condition of the case. The cultural afterlife of the Bahamas years has, in the decades since Edward's death, undergone a transformation that the documentary should acknowledge explicitly because it represents a shift in how the public understands the entire Windsor story. For most of the 20th century, the dominant frame was romantic. Edward was the king who gave up the throne for love. Wallis was the woman for whom a king sacrificed everything. The Bahamas were, in this telling, a footnote, an obscure colonial interlude between the grand drama of the abdication and the quiet twilight of Parisian exile. The romance was the story. Everything else was detail. That frame has broken. It began to crack with the release of wartime intelligence files and the publication of books that examined the post-abdication years with more skepticism than romance. It cracked further with the emergence of documentary treatments that approached the Bahamas period not as a footnote, but as a central chapter. And it broke decisively with the newer wave of production that have reframed the entire Windsor story around the wartime years rather than the abdication itself. The Channel 4 and PBS documentary presented the wartime and post-abdication period explicitly as the era where the true scandal resided, not in the love affair, which was dramatic but ultimately personal, but in what Edward did when the love affair stopped being the main plot and governance, judgment, loyalty, and moral seriousness became the test that mattered. The Bahamas years in this retelling are not a footnote to the abdication. They are the central exhibit in the case against Edward's character. They are the period that transforms him from a romantic figure into a cautionary one, from a man who chose love over duty into a man who, when given a second chance at duty, failed it comprehensively, morally, administratively, and in the Oakes case, possibly in ways that approach criminal obstruction, even if the murder itself was someone else's act. More recent documentary treatments have pushed further still. Productions for grounding newly recovered FBI and government records have presented the Bahamas years through the lens of Nazi sympathizer associations, suspicious financial arrangements, lavish wartime spending, and the murder itself, framing the exile not as romantic sacrifice, but as a period of sustained moral failure in which the former king's character was exposed by the very isolation that was supposed to protect the institution from its consequences. These retellings do not always agree on the specifics. They do not all reach the same conclusions about Edward's degree of complicity in the Oaks case or about the precise nature of his wartime disloyalties, but they share a common frame. The romance is over. The Bahamas are the real story, and the real story is not about love. It is about what happens when a man shaped entirely for pageantry is given actual responsibility and proves, not through dramatic villainy, but through the steady accumulation of poor judgment, moral blindness, defensive instinct, and the inability to distinguish between private grievance and public duty, that he was never equal to it. The strongest emotional image for the closing of this documentary is not the murder alone, though the murder is the story's dramatic center. It is the wider picture, the image of a man who once wore the most visible crown in the world, ending up in a colony he despised, trying to control the story around a dead friend's body, while the island around him carried poverty, racial grievance, and the war's long shadow. If you want something more specific, more concrete, use the stillness of Westbourne after the discovery, the grotesque crime in a rich man's bedroom, the feathers and the burns and the silence, and the former King of England already thinking not about justice, but about containment. That image, that moment of institutional reflex overriding human obligation, is the image the documentary should leave with the viewer, because it captures, more precisely than any other single frame, what the Bahamas years revealed about Edward's character and about the institution that produced him. This story is not finally about whether Edward was a traitor in the absolute sense, whether he would have collaborated with the Nazis, whether he was personally involved in criminal activity, whether the most extreme allegations against him can be sustained by the available evidence. Reasonable historians disagree on these questions, and the documentary should be honest about that disagreement rather than pretending to a certainty the record does not support. What the story is about, what the Bahamas strip bare, what the riot and the murder and the compromised investigation collectively reveal, is what happens when a man shaped for visibility but not responsibility is given a stage and still cannot distinguish between his own interests and the interests of the people he's supposed to serve. Edward's failure was not spectacular. It was not the failure of a villain or a traitor. It was the failure of a man who had been raised at the summit of privilege and had never been required to develop the moral resources necessary to exercise power on behalf of anyone other than himself. He wanted to be seen. He wanted to be admired. He wanted to be treated as he believed he deserved. And when the world failed to provide those things, when the colony rioted, when a friend was murdered, when the investigation required transparency rather than control, he reached for the only tools he had ever known: management, censorship, avoidance, and the assumption that the rules applied to other people. The Bahamas stripped the love story of its glamour. What remained was a study in the cost of a royal name emptied of its obligations, the moral vacancy of exile without introspection, and the fact that a colonial society, its workers, its poor, its black majority, absorbed the human consequences of a British family drama it had not created and could not escape. The colony did not ask for a disgrace king. It received one, and the price of his presence was paid not by the man in Government House, but by the people outside it, the men who rioted for wages and were shot, the community whose murder case was mishandled by a governor more interested in control than in truth, and the island whose real history was overshadowed for decades by the glamour of the couple who despised it. That is the story the Bahamas tell, not the love story, the other one,